So the purpose of this video is I'm going to provide an English explanation of what Sheikh Alaa Mahdawi of Iraq is saying in his videos. Sheikh Alaa Mahdawi is a Shia scholar, and he's gotten a lot of attention recently, and he makes some claims that are not frequently spoken about. And my purpose is simply to explain in English because his viewership is mostly Arabic speakers from the Gulf and Gulf region, Iraq itself, the Middle East, or Arabic speakers abroad. And his sayings have gotten a lot of attention. So my goal is to just give a English explanation of what he's saying for English speakers. So for each video that he does, my plan is to study it, fact check it, and give an English overview explanation of what he says. In this video, which I'll post a link to the video in the description, he is responding to a caller who calls in and asks what the difference between Sunni and Shia are. And he makes several claims, so I'll go through the claims, and some of the claims are kind of controversial. The first one being that the Prophet was killed in a conspiracy over leadership succession, and he was actually poisoned by his then wife Aisha in collaboration with Umar and Abu Bakr. So those who know, Aisha was his wife, Umar and Abu Bakr were his some of his companions. So I'll just go through basically some of the things that he said in the video and give some explanation. The first one that he highlights is it's a well-known event called the Thursday Calamity. Basically, 3 days before the Prophet, 3 to 5 days before the Prophet's death, he wanted to write something, and he said that he was going to write it so that his nation or his followers would not go astray. He was very sick at the moment, but Umar ibn al-Khattab was very vocal in saying that he's ill and we have the Quran and there's no need. So he basically didn't allow the Prophet to write that statement. Ibn Abbas was somebody who narrated the event. He was a companion of the Prophet and describes it as a disaster, expressing regret that the dispute prevented the Prophet from writing his guidance. I think a prophet, as great as the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, if he wanted to write something on his deathbed, and he indicates that this writing will prevent the Muslim nation from going astray, and Omar not allowing that to happen, I do agree with that is a profound loss. It's something that should not have happened. So here is the hadith that is in Sahih al-Bukhari, and it gives some more explanation about that event. It says the Prophet is seriously ill, and go near so that the Prophet may write for you a statement after which you will not go astray. Okay? And Omar said, they started arguing in front of the Prophet about whether he should write it, and whether some companions, it says, it doesn't give all the names of the companions, Omar was one of them, were against him writing it, and some were for it. And the Prophet was ill, and he got upset by this. He was hurt by this, and he used the Arabic phrase qumu. Qumu is an imperative, which is saying go away. It's kind of like an aggressive way of saying it's when you're displeased, when you're angry, when you're upset with something, you would use the word qum. Okay, so what we have here is basically the Prophet wanted to write something. He was upset that they were arguing, and he obviously got upset by it because he used this word. You don't use this word when you're happy. And that writing was prevented from happening. So we're going to analyze, this ties into why we're going to analyze why Omar was against him writing that, and the gravity of him not doing it. Here's another hadith in Sahih Bukhari 3053, and this one is found at 5669. It shows Ibn Abbas weeping till his tears wetted the gravels of the ground. So, I mean, a companion of the Prophet to add, to confirm that this was something that was unfortunate, that should not have been prevented, the Prophet should have been prevented, is that one of his close companions was crying profusely that this didn't happen. Okay. Who was Ibn Abbas? Ibn Abbas was the son of Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, the Prophet's uncle. So he's the son of his uncle. As a child, he was especially close to the Prophet. So Ibn Abbas narrating this is something, based on who he was, very credible, that he was very upset by it. So, because we were not there, these are things that happened many hundreds of years ago. We have to look at precedent. We have to look at the Quran. We have to infer these events. We weren't there. Nobody has exact proof. We can only infer. So we turn to the Quran. And in the Quran, it says in chapter 49, verse 1, O you who believe, do not put yourselves forward before Allah and His Messenger, and fear Allah. Indeed, Allah is hearing and knowing. Okay, so this is basically saying that in the explanations that no one should precede the Prophet by word or deed. You shouldn't think make your own opinion or decision of or an action of what the Prophet is commanding. Here, the Prophet is commanding that he wants to write something, and Omar is making the decision for the Prophet here, and saying that Omar is deciding whether or not the Prophet should be allowed to write something, and that goes clearly against this Quranic verse. So I think we can, and based on Ibn Abbas and based on the Prophet getting clearly angry, we can reasonably assume that this was a wrong action by Omar. Omar should not have done that. So that is the Quranic verse 49:1, which, interestingly, this verse was revealed because Omar and Abu Bakr were having another argument over who the appointment of a leader for the delegation of the Banu Tamim clan. So I won't get into the Bani Tamim, but you can definitely, the Banu Tamim, you can read into that. But it's interesting that essentially Omar has repeated the same thing that he was reprimanded for by Allah, for basically speaking over the Prophet and arguing, putting himself before Allah and the Messenger. And the argument was over something similar. Now, the Thursday calamity was something that happened after the Prophet appointed Osama, a young companion, as commander over a military force. And I'll get to that in a moment. But it was also over the appointment of a leader. And shortly after that decision by the Prophet states he wants to write something so that the Islamic nation will not go astray. And Omar was against it. Omar started arguing, and he was against it, which led the Prophet to be upset. And it's interesting that in a previous event where the Prophet was deliberating over a leadership decision, Abu Bakr and Umar were arguing in his presence, and an ayah was revealed essentially explaining about what people should not do. And this ayah was referencing Abu Bakr and Umar, which interestingly became the first and second caliph of the Islamic Ummah after the death of the Prophet, which is a issue of great contention between Shia and Sunni scholars. Shia scholars saying that they were not chosen to be the caliph, they were not fit to be the caliphs, and Sunni scholars saying the opposite. But in the Quran, a verse was revealed basically saying that their behavior amongst the Prophet was not acceptable, and that argument was also over political decisions about who should be in leadership. And in verse 49 too, referencing the same event, Allah says, O you have believed, do not raise your voices above the voice of the Prophet, or be loud to him in speech like the loudness of some of you to others, lest your deeds become worthless while you perceive not. So again, this verse is referencing that argument that was done in front of the Prophet between Abu Bakr and Umar. And God is warning here that if you do this, if you disrespect the Prophet, or you speak loudly in front of him, or you make decisions for him, that the punishment is that your deeds can become worthless. All the good things that you did, they are now deemed worthless because of this Quranic verse. Now, what preceded this Thursday calamity where Umar didn't want the Prophet to write this letter on his deathbed? The Prophet appointed Osama ibn Zayd as commander over a military force, and Osama at that time was between 18 to 20 years old. He was very young. And this would have given him military authority over senior and experienced companions, including Abu Bakr and Umar. Now, this decision by the Prophet was something of great controversy between them. Again, similar to the previous event spoken about over Banu Tamim in the Quran. Again, the Prophet's deciding on who should lead, who should be in the leadership position, caused great controversy. And another hadith was released where the Prophet is narrated as saying, if you are criticizing Osama's appointment, then you have also criticized his father's appointment before him. Basically saying that he was, that the Prophet was insisting on this, and that people should not question his decision making here. He's the Prophet. And everybody was, including Abu Bakr and Umar, were told to fall under his command. Repeat. All notable Muhajirin, Ansar, and elders, including Abu Bakr and Umar, were all enlisted in the army in order to join Osama's army. Abu Bakr and Umar, in Al-Sheikh Al-Mufid, that Abu Bakr and Umar refused and disobeyed after the Prophet's death. They did not join Osama's army. I looked in some other hadiths and other sources, and it did say that Abu Bakr and Umar had recommended their own candidates, which were leaders of very large tribes, but that the Prophet insisted. And history shows us that Osama's army was ultimately very successful in their campaign, despite his young age. Now, after the Prophet died, so again, I want to just draw a parallel between this previous argument that over the Banu Tamim clan, which a verse was revealed essentially, censoring Abu Bakr and Umar for their behavior. And then the same thing happened near the death of the Prophet. And after the Prophet made this command that Abu Bakr and Umar join Osama's army, we had the Thursday calamity where the Prophet was not allowed to write this note on his deathbed. Now, again, we can say here, based on the Quranic verse, that what Abu Bakr and Umar did by questioning the Prophet's decision here was going against what the Quran taught, the Quran and the Sunnah taught. And it's it also it goes to show that once the Prophet died, Abu Bakr and Umar indeed did not follow through with the Prophet's command, and they did not join Osama's army. Now, so we can make precedent here that basically the Abu Bakr and Umar, despite their record as being companions of the Prophet, they did on several occasions, and they were even spoken about by Allah in the Quran as going against his, not agreeing with his decisions, not fully being committed to him, to the Prophet. They were his companions, but on several occasions, they made their own decisions, despite what the Prophet wanted. They did their own. They did what they wanted. So to gather more precedent, let's look at the conduct of Umar and Abu Bakr during the Prophet's lifetime in battles or joining military campaigns. And we find several things that are a little bit concerning. This is talking about the Battle of Hunain. So there is hadiths in Bukhari that, and a Quranic verse even was revealed, where Umar and others retreated temporarily from the Battle of Hunain. Some scholars call there was a confusion that happened, but nevertheless, Umar and some of the other companions, they fled the battle. Only a handful of the companions stayed with the Prophet. Ali ibn Abi Talib, Abbas, these names. And the Prophet, they stayed, they fought despite the odds, and they kept while other companions fled. And a Quranic verse was revealed that basically confirms that this happened, this temporary retreat happened. Okay. Then we have in Tafsir al-Tabari another narration that Umar al-Khattab also fled the battle of Uhud. And here it quotes him saying, on the day of Uhud, when we ran away, so I ran away and climbed the mountain. And I saw myself, this is Umar talking, I saw myself running and jumping like a mountain goat. Here is the Tafsir al-Tabari volume and page number if you want to research that independently. And then also at the Battle of Khaybar. In the Battle of Khaybar, the Prophet first gave the command to Abu Bakr, who could not secure victory, and returned. The next day, Umar led an attack against the fort, but he too was unable to conquer it and eventually retreated. The next day, he gave the flag to Imam Ali, who was able to secure victory for the Muslims over the fortress. Okay, at the Battle of Badr, Abu Bakr was present, but he did not participate directly in the frontline fighting. Abu Bakr's role was to guard and attend the Prophet's tent. Okay, so both Umar and Abu Bakr participated in major battles, but they did not record an explicit incident naming either of them as directly explaining. They were not, neither of them were, very, very, very adept at engaging in combat on behalf of the Prophet's orders. There were other times in very key battles where they either didn't fight or they fled, they retreated, they ran away. And as far as the research I've done, I didn't find specific incidents narrated by companions or the Prophet himself speaking to the bravery in battle, or the specific slayings of enemy combatants in battle by Abu Bakr and Umar. There's also a conception that Umar ibn al-Khattab conquered Persia, but after digging into the facts, we see that he set foot initially with the Muslim army from Medina to lead the campaign personally against Persia, and he arrived at a camp at Sirar, which is about 3 miles from Medina. And for whatever reason, at this camp, he decided to turn back. He said that The narrations say that his companions urged him to turn back so that he can be spared to lead the ummah. But this is not really a precedent in Islamic leadership under the Prophet, where the Prophet would hang back and give written orders while his men would fight on his behalf. The Prophet was always present in those battles, as was Imam Ali. They were always present there on the battlefield leading. And in fact, when we research more in depth, we see that Umar ibn Khattab never personally set foot in Persian territory. He was always 1,000 to 1,500 kilometers away in Medina, and he mostly just gave written instructions to his generals, such as Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. So, again, he wasn't somebody who was there present on the battlefield, always willing to sacrifice himself for the Prophet or for the Islamic Ummah. So this adds just more confirmation that this issue of the Thursday calamity, him not having problem with leadership decisions, being adverse to wanting to go and fight and die in battle. There is quite a bit of evidence and precedent showing that was the case. Okay. So now we've established, so basically what Sheikh Alaa is saying, we've confirmed all of it. The Thursday calamity came after, we look at the timeline. We see the Prophet is sick, and he makes a controversial leadership decision. He appoints Osama ibn Zayd over Abu Bakr and Umar to lead the battle. His Prophet's order is criticized, not immediately obeyed. A day or two after he gives this order, the Prophet is on his deathbed and he wants to write a letter that will keep the nation from going astray. And Umar prevents it from happening. Then, shortly after that, after Umar prevented this, Aisha, and this is narrated in Hadith 6897, says, "We poured medicine into the mouth of Allah's Messenger during his illness, and he pointed out to us intending to say, 'Don't pour medicine into my mouth.' We thought this was his refusal out of the aversion a patient usually has for medicine, how a child, when you give a child, a baby, medicine, and they move their mouth or they try to not take the medicine. She's essentially saying it was something like that, where the Prophet was saying, 'Don't give me the medicine,' but she insisted and she gave it to him anyways. But this is the Prophet that we're talking about, and as in the Quran, the verse 49:2 says in the Quran that we don't make decisions for the Prophet. He's the Prophet. But nevertheless, she put medicine into his mouth, or what she called medicine. And then when the Prophet was feeling better, when he was able to talk more easily, he tells Aisha, "Didn't I forbid you to pour medicine into my mouth?" And said, "We thought you did because of the aversion one usually has for medicine." So we have Osama ibn Zayd's appointment, which Abu Bakr, who is the father of Aisha, Umar, and some other companions disagree with. Then we have the Prophet wanting to make a writing, deciding on who will be, to keep the Ummah from going astray. Then we have the forceful giving of medicine. I think many Sunnis say that the Prophet was killed from a piece of meat that was laced with poison by a Jewish woman. But that event was 4 years before he died. And one of his companions actually ate the meat and died instantly. So the poison that came from that meat was meant to kill someone instantly, not 4 years later. I did some research on if there's any poisons that exist that will kill somebody 4 years later, and I didn't find anything, especially anything that existed in 7th century Arabia. Poisoning was common in 7th century Arabia, so it's not, crazy to think that he was poisoned. But the fact, those narrating that he died from poison 4 years later, uh, are referencing the only evidence, or the only document that alludes to him being killed by the Jewish woman, is a narration by Aisha herself, which she claims she heard the Prophet agonizing before his death and saying that he has pain in his stomach from what the Jewish woman gave him. But we also have Aisha talking about here where the Prophet is saying, "Why did you put medicine into my mouth when I told you not to?" And this is coming a day after the Thursday calamity. Now, the Prophet died 1 to 2 days after receiving this so-called medicine. Now, to make things, we have to look at so all of these events here have some connection to one another. And the next thing that Sheikh Alaa talks about is that right when the Prophet died, or slightly before, the Banu Aslam tribe, which had very close ties to Abu Bakr, the father of Aisha, they arrive and they enter into Medina, and they are kind of an army that is supporting Abu Bakr. There's narrations even that Banu Aslam would go around and threaten people by force that if they didn't give the bay'ah to Abu Bakr, that they would face violence. So it's very strange that, after the appointment, the Thursday calamity, giving him this medicine, he immediately dies. The Prophet immediately dies. And then this armed tribe enters Medina and acts as an enforcer for Abu Bakr. As soon as the Prophet dies on the same day, Abu Bakr, Umar, and a few of the Ansar and Muhajirin, along with the Banu Aslam tribe, they gather in what's called the Saqifa event, and they basically just announce that Abu Bakr is now the caliph of the Muslims. So we have these things all sort of intertwined and connected, and this is the case that Sheikh Alaa is making, basically saying that if we study all these events and their, the past behavior of Abu Bakr and Umar, and the intertwining of these events, he comes to the conclusion that the Prophet was killed. He was poisoned by Aisha, and it was in collusion with Abu Bakr and Umar in order to consolidate power and go against whatever the Prophet's wishes were. Now, another issue that's of contention is that the Prophet has died, and Umar and Abu Bakr, they didn't go to his funeral. Instead of going to his funeral, they went to the Saqifa and had a meeting, basically announcing that Abu Bakr would be caliph. And Umar ibn Khattab, when he became caliph in sort of the same fashion that Abu Bakr was. So that is the explanation, and verifying all the hadiths and that are related to Sheikh Alaa's claim that the Prophet in fact was killed by Aisha in collusion with Umar and Abu Bakr. It had nothing to do with a Jewish woman who gave meat 4 years before his death. The second major claim he makes is that Umar ibn Khattab engaged in what's called tahrif of the Quran, which means altering or changing it or just kind of making up his own things. And one example he gives is based on what's called rajm, or stoning adulterers to death. Now, the act of stoning adulterers to death began as a Christian and a Jewish tradition. It's in the Bible, it's in the Torah. There was one incident before a Quranic verse was revealed where the Prophet uh, allowed a stoning to happen, but the circumstances of that were very different to just sort of standard adultery. But nevertheless, in Bukhari and Muslim, Umar is narrated as saying, Allah sent Muhammad with the truth and sent down the book to him. Among what was revealed to him was the verse of stoning. We recited it, understood it, and memorized it. The messenger of Allah stoned adulterers, and we stoned after him. This is the narration. And it says, were it not that people may say Umar has added to the book of Allah what it's not part of it, I would have written it, the verse, into the Quran. Umar would have written it into the Quran. Now, he made this statement 12 years after the Prophet's death. So for 12 years after the Prophet's death, essentially, he allowed for stoning to happen. However, the Prophet, died 12 years before that, and whenever this verse was revealed, the verse specifically states the punishment for adultery as being 100 lashes. It doesn't say unmarried. It just says, that any adulterers should face 100 lashes. Okay. Now, as abrogation, here is a Quranic verse says, "Ma nansakh min ayatin aw." If we ever abrogate a verse or cause it to be forgotten, we replace it with a better or similar. Now, the key word here is we replace it. So if something is changed, if an earlier verse in the Quran is negated or altered in some way, it's replaced with another verse that's in the Quran itself. There does not exist anything that was supposedly revealed to the Prophet as a Quranic verse, but never made it into the Quran, but is treated as something that is in the Quran. This doesn't exist. And the fact that in the Quran there is a specific ruling on how adulterers should be treated, it doesn't make sense that Umar would do something that is not in the Quran or specifically given instructions on how to deal with. Now, let's take another example. In Surah Al-Baqarah, before this ayah was revealed, Muslims would pray in the direction of Jerusalem. However, once this verse was revealed, Allah commanded the Muslims to turn to the Qibla. Now, the fact that the Prophet used to pray towards Jerusalem doesn't allow us as Muslims to pray to Jerusalem. So what Umar is essentially saying is the same thing here. He said the Prophet used to do something, but then a Quranic verse was revealed stating that it should be done in a different way. And the Muslims did it in that way that was prescribed for in the Quran. They cannot do something else that was done earlier because it was prescribed in the Quran to not do that specific thing. Another example of abrogation in the Quran is over alcohol usage. There, in chapter 2, verse 219, it says that it is a great sin, and the sin is greater than the benefit. It's talking about wine and gambling. Then it says, O you who believe, do not approach prayer while you are drunk, while you are intoxicated. Then later, a Quranic verse was revealed that says, O you who believe, intoxicants, so shun them so you may be successful. So the word pbuh means to completely avoid it. Intoxicants, gambling, idols. These are all evil of Satan's handiwork. So shun them so you may be successful. So abrogation, if it exists in the Quran itself. Stoning never existed in the Quran itself. And there's a Quranic verse that specifically prohibits it. So based on this evidence and what Sheikh Alaa is saying, I would agree with him that, Umar insisting on stoning to be continued, it goes against Quranic principles and it goes against the precedent. Another example of Umar organizing something or doing something based on his own decision making and not off the sunnah of the Prophet is Taraweeh prayer. Now, there are many hadith that show that Taraweeh prayer was something that the Prophet did in congregation at the mosque for a few nights. When more companions joined, he stopped coming out. The key is he stopped coming out. And he said his reasoning was, I was afraid that it would become obligatory on you. Okay? However, Umar, when he became caliph, he found people praying Taraweeh in scattered groups and decided to bring all worshippers together behind one imam. And he even calls this bid'ah hasana, or a good innovation. Now, I find error in these two things here because, first of all, the Prophet, he stopped coming to the mosque altogether. So if Sunnis are following the sunnah of the Prophet, that means that they should not even be going to the mosque to pray Taraweeh. Because the Prophet stopped going into the mosque to pray Taraweeh. Okay? And then, so this goes, Umar's decision here goes against, and it's true because in Sunni mosques even today, even though Taraweeh is not stated as specifically obligatory, it's almost treated as obligatory because if you go to any Sunni mosque during Ramadan, the majority of the male and even some females will be praying all the Taraweeh throughout the entire month of Ramadan and go through the entire Quran. Instead of using that time to say maybe, I don't know what, have lectures about tafsir al-Quran and learn things, whatever the Prophet's wisdom, this is essentially going against what he did, which is he stopped coming out. After he stopped this, there is no narration anywhere in any book that the Prophet went to the mosque and prayed Taraweeh in congregation. So this was an invention by Umar. And here he calls it bid'ah hasana. But the hadith say that كل محدث بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة النار. كل بدعة, all innovation is wrong. There's no good innovation and bad innovation. It's no innovation. So, based on this, based on precedent and what Sheikh Alaa was saying, I would also agree with him that Umar, in several different ways, essentially made his own alterations to the Quran and the Sunnah. Thank you. I will add a link to this file in the description and also a link to the video. Assalamu alaikum.